Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight's event is the fifth in a series of talks celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Festival of Britain. The festival theme season is a collaboration between the Black Country Studies Centre and Artsfest Online. The Black Country Living Museum is currently hosting a mini celebration of the festival, and you can book your visit online now. I'll put a link to that in the chat a bit later on. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Jane Webb, Deputy Head of the Wolverhampton School of Art. Jane will be talking about the Wolverhampton's Market Festival Hall, and she will explore what the new market took from the Festival of Britain. And just a bit of housekeeping, if you have any questions for Jane, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll try and go through them towards the end. And a quick reminder that the event is being recorded, so please don't share any confidential information. So with all that said, welcome Jane, and over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Can't change there we are. Before I start, I just wanted to talk about my colleague Tony Herbert. Tony, Ben Andrews and myself did some research on the retail market in the 90s. And as far as I know, none of us did anything about it. Tony died a couple of years ago, and he was a wonderfully inspirational person who was very keen to look at local design history and see the importance of it in relation to national and international. So this one's for you, Tony. Okay, I'm going to talk about the retail market, and that is the building which is on the left. The current state of the building is on the right, and i.e. it's not there at all. And I think there's something really quite significant about that. As a resident of Wolverhampton, and as someone who's known Wolverhampton their entire life, I've noticed that there is a tendency in Wolverhampton to erase the physical history of the city. And that strikes me as really quite important. The reasons for doing so are often really admirable, laudable, to do with innovation and moving forward. But there is often a sense in which the value and worth of the city is perhaps misconstrued because of this loss of the sort of fabric of history. And I don't mean to be drawing on some kind of despondency theory. Marshall Sahlins, the anthropologist, calls it that. If you believe without history and tradition, culture empties out. I don't mean that. It's not about culture. This is about perhaps the way that Wolverhampton is perceived and its value and worth in those terms. So the reason I mention it is because it seems to me that the Market Hall sits in a really interesting place within that debate. So perhaps we can draw on it at the end. Okay, so this evening I'm going to talk about the market in context, the Festival of Britain and the Midlands, and really try and look specifically at the retail market and draw out the connections with the festival. So as opposed to my first talk, which was about the Festival of Britain broadly, this is going to be really minutiae, looking at one building, and then finish with some of the implicit ideas that maybe came out of the festival to do with food and history. So this is just by way of conclusion. Okay, so Wolverhampton market in context. Now, there is something really important, I think, about the market, because it sits at a moment when Wolverhampton was really thinking about its future. And the future of Wolverhampton was written about in a leaflet which was then published called Wolverhampton of the Future, a report on post-war planning. And I just want to read some of this forward, which comes from W. Mervyn Law, who was the borough engineer and who really designed the building that I'm going to be talking about. I don't know anything about Mervyn Law. I don't even know what W stands for. So if anyone out there does know something, it'd be great to hear. I just want to read this. because I think it's quite significant. Many years must elapse before the result is achieved, i.e. the result of a regeneration plan. Indeed, in one sense, there can be no finality, as coming years will bring new ideas. But with the definite aim in view, I feel certain that with the continuous and united help of all men of goodwill, we can do a great deal in a comparatively short space of time, and that many of us now alive will live to see a town in some respects rebuilt, yet retaining traditions, its atmosphere, its individuality. The citizen himself must develop a civic pride and an unselfish devotion to the well-being of the community in which he lives. Better environment will help to create better men and women. Better men and women will see to it that there is no turning back. Now, I think this is a really significant quote because it gives the spirit in which this vision was created. Now, the actual replanning was set around the thing that we know so well, which is the ring road. So there wasn't a ring road, and this was thought to be a way of really dealing with the congestion that was very much part of Wolverhampton on this really quite chaotic medieval plan. So as well as the ring road, what was really focused on was this civic centre, and you can see it's situated around St. Peter's Church, and there was an exhibition to show what this civic centre might look like. Now that had real big implications for the markets, not just the wholesale market, which was right by the St. Peter's Church, but the retail market was further away from the church. And you can see it here, it's on the left here with these archways. That was on Cheapside, and it was like a big square building which had another side on North Street, which is by the art school now. And this is the inside of the building in 1953, and there was a centenary in 1953 because the building had been opened for 100 years. Incidentally, there seems to have been some connection between this retail market and the Great Exhibition, which of course the Festival of Britain was commemorating, because a Coalbrookdale fountain, which had been at the Great Exhibition, was purchased specifically for the market hall, the Swan and Boy, to be in the centre of the market. So there seems to be this connection. Now, the centenary was a really important event because it established a moment of time when there was going to be change. Now, the plan showed that the retail market would move from its situation to this site, which was on Market Street. However, in the plan, there was a suggestion that perhaps this might not happen for financial reasons. It was a bit of a difficult site. And indeed, that proved to be true. And so the market was put on this site, which is Brickkiln Croft. Now that area was, as you can see, a cleared area, and it was often used for festivals and fairs, which in some ways is quite interesting because it was itself a festival site. Now I've got a picture of Norman Pritchard there, who was the president of the Retail Market Hall Tenants Association. And in the centenary of the older retail market, he provides a really wonderful description about shopping in a market. He says, a visit to the market is something more than a shopping expedition. Such a visit provides an escape from the morbid, mechanized world to the convivial spirit of the town fair, an escape from cogs, numbers, and benumbing kitchen work to an atmosphere of pleasantry and freer personal expression, that eternal need of our island race. Isn't that a wonderful description, which I think is a sort of idea of this festival of shopping that a market can be. So as well as a site being a site for festivals, the whole atmosphere of the market as a festival is quite an interesting connection to the Festival of Britain. Now, the centenary brochure actually had a model in it for the new festival. And although the text in it suggests that there were still things to be overcome in terms of objections about the new market, it looks pretty certain that the market was going to happen. So really, the centenary is the death knell for that retail market. Now, this is the retail market as it was designed. And what clearly shows, there's clearly differences here. This was the style of building that was established in the programme, which was the future for Wolverhampton. And this is the style that was built. So there's this shift that happens. Peter Larkham has written a great article, wrote it in 2002, about the rebuilding of Wolverhampton. And he calls this the modernist classical style. And yet clearly we have a festival style. So what has been the change? So I'm going to look at the festival in the Midlands briefly and think about some connections. This is obviously the South Bank exhibition. You can see it behind me as well. And hopefully by now you're familiar with this idea. And as you know, across the country, there were lots of events that commemorated this, this exhibition. And there were also travelling exhibitions which went to Birmingham as well. In Wolverhampton, there was the Eastpool Park constructed for the Festival of Britain. There was the Fallings Park Methodist Church, for instance, had celebrated the Festival of Britain just in themselves. There was all sorts of events like a big cycle race. And what you have is a sense of the festival being in people's mindsets. But there's also evidence of works trips to the South Bank, like Chatterways, for instance, who was a structural engineering company. So I think it's pretty certain that someone who was like Mervyn Law, the borough engineer, would have probably visited the South Bank or certainly had a lot of connections to it. The other thing was that came out of the exhibition is there was lots of narrative about the South Bank itself, and that came from some of the architects involved in the exhibition. So it's very much thinking about the future of the festival and its impact. The Architectural Review had a special edition on the South Bank. There's a wonderful film called Brief City, which has a real narrative that's very directed towards people thinking about planning. And there's also things on details of the festival, like the graphics in the festival from the Penrose Annual. So I'm going to use those sources, mainly the Architectural Review, which I've got right next to me actually, as a way of thinking about the impact of the festival. But certainly people had, even if they hadn't visited the festival, lots of opportunities to see and draw the principles of the building and the ideas of planning from things like this. What's apparent when you look at the Architectural Review over the 30s, 40s and 50s is that the ideas that were played out in the Festival of Britain didn't just appear from nowhere, that they were being built on all the way through. So when I pick out things from the Festival of Britain, I'll also try and draw on previous references to it in Architectural Review, because I think that's quite useful as well. So there were lots of opportunities to start being imbibed, if that's the right word, by these principles. Coventry, as somewhere in the Midlands that had literally been rebuilt after the Festival of Britain, was also a very important source. It must have been, it's a crucible really, in which festival style was being played out. And this was understood, as it says in the Architect's Journal, as the city of tomorrow, which had this really exciting character to it. In Coventry, and built slightly later, was the amazing Market Hall. And this sci-fi building was part of the regeneration, and this was in 1958. And Wolverhampton sees itself set directly in sort of competition with this market. The Express and Star published a supplement to to sort of celebrate the new market, retail market. And in it, they say, true, Coventry got in first with the post-war market, pure and simple. But Wolverhampton now has the first market built since the war, which is a complete form of commercial centre with shops and offices incorporated. So I think what's really significant about this description is that the market isn't just a market, it's kind of like a mini town, a mini commercial centre. And perhaps it's in seeing that we can really draw this comparison to the festival site. There are also connections in that it received a Civic Trust Award for its festival style from, for the actual in 1960 as it was built. And it was opened by Herbert Morrison, who is obviously closely connected to the festival and really made it happen. He arrived, and really in his capacity as president of the Association of Municipal Corporations, but his connection, I think, also says something about the status of the market in relation to the festival. And he says, I think the boast of Wolverhampton Town Council that it will be the finest market in the country is probably true. Probably, of course. The article's quite funny because they end up really obsessing about the fact he's wearing sandals. But basically, you have these strong, driving, ambitious force to take on these principles of the festival and make it happen in Wolverhampton. So the actual market had these two blocks at right angles to each other with an entrance in that corner. It was set on this island site. So you have School Street at the top, Salop Street and Peel Street down the bottom. It had this low block in the centre, which was the main retail site, the main market. And then you had a meat and fish hall on this side of the building, which is the smaller block. And then underneath that, you had a restaurant and a sunken garden. You had an underground car park, which potentially, originally it was thought to double potentially as a bomb shelter. And of course, this is 1953 when this was designed. And you're thinking really about its connection to the Second World War and the closeness of those times. It also had an outdoor retail centre. I'm sure people listening will remember the building itself. And below the offices, you had shops, some of which were through shops. So it was a commercial centre. It was much more ambitious than just a market hall. I think significantly, a lot of the people that contributed to the building were also local manufacturers. And there's something about that call to arms about the future of Wolverhampton that came in that forward from the regeneration plan, that this calls on, that there is a real desire to make this a collective effort. Okay, so I'm going to look at the market in more detail in relation to the planning principles from the South Bank's rather unwieldy title. Quite handily in the architectural review, there is a list really of things that characterise the festival style. And these are the functional tradition. There is actually the nautical style, which I've left out because it's probably not that relevant to where we're sitting at the moment in the Midlands, but that was also in the list. I am going to talk about watery things, but watery things relevant to us. Intricacy comes to modern architecture, sky pattern, interrupted view, the use of hazards, exploiting the third dimension, planting in odd corners, wallscape, street furniture and lettering. I'm not going to talk about all of that in relation to the market hall, but I think the things I talk about, you're going to see as so familiar now, but they are things that emerge from the festival. The first thing I want to talk about then is the functional tradition. And this is a really interesting idea that underlies everything, I think, everything else. And I just want to read that beginning introduction. It's from Architectural Review again. Alongside and contemporary with the historical styles, there has always existed a tradition of non-stylistic architecture, derived from a straightforward fulfillment of function by the simplest engineering means and from the logical use of materials. Now, in some ways, that is a kind of expression of modernist ideas that there is some truth underlying historical style. But the way the Architectural Review had been dealing with it for a number of years is by looking at vernacular types of architecture, I guess you could call it, or architecture that was related to function very clearly. This is an article that was written on the functional style on your right from 1949, and you can see Aldersley Junction, Canal Junction, as examples of this functional style. So I think the idea of local architecture that was functional is really important to the market hall, and it is central really to its construction. Number one, the person who designed the building was the borough engineer, not an architect per se, and I think the driving force is about engineering. There is a very detailed description in the minutes which the borough engineer reports to the Markets Committee about the choice of barrel vault, the reasons for choosing barrel vault around ventilation, around northern lights. There is something really beautiful actually about this engineering resolution to the function of the market and the idea of hygiene within the market that comes from the building itself. And it's interesting because there's a letter from the Royal Institute of British Architects that the Reconstruction Committee receives in 1943, which says, I think you should get an architect involved. And they say, oh, we don't need an architect. We've got the borough engineer and he's doing a fine job. And actually they sort of suggest that RIBA only want jobs for architects really, and they're just trying to promote architects. So they reject that idea. So there's a real trust in the engineering principles as being at the basis of this building design. I think it relates very much to the functional tradition. This is an amazing cutaway view that you can see looking towards Peel Street, and you can see the principles, the functionality of this building and the way that the architect, well, the engineer is thinking about flow through the building itself. The engineering planning is also part of the style of the building as well. This is the restaurant, which is the lower restaurant. Many of us will have been here, but as an antiques market. And it had this amazing sort of ripple false barrel vault in it, which took the language of the engineering which was above it and used it as a decorative motif, but also it had its functions in terms of hiding the lights and the beams so that it made this beautiful clean line. There's also acoustic panels in the room, which are also decorative. So there is something about using the aesthetic of the engineering style and making it into this decorative motif all the way through the building. It also connects to the Riverside restaurant at the Festival of Britain with this sort of amazing rippling surface inside and out. Another feature of the list was the interrupted view. And that might sound a bit confusing, but it's about having this sort of complexity when you look out or you see different elements of the architecture. And A Brief City has this wonderful statement within it, and I won't play it, I'm just going to quote it. The British don't really like, I won't do the accent, it's too posh. The British don't really like rhetoric in their building, and there are surprisingly few ceremonial avenues in our cities. On purpose then, the South Bank had no processional way and no vistas. I thought that's really interesting because it's echoed in an earlier article in the Architectural Review about vistas, which is by Gordon Cullen, who goes on to write a book around this idea. Now, Gordon Cullen had done this article in 1949, and he suggests that it's an attempt to revive the objective way of looking and to establish a basis for an art of environment founded on that way. Now, what I think is really interesting is that he is trying to find a way of looking at architecture that is objective, and the description of something like the functional tradition is about sort of seeing past style. So there's in both the searching for it and the finding of it, there's this desire to find this sort of fundamental kind of reality about architecture that goes beyond style. And part of this seeing is to look at things like vistas. So he compares the grandiose vista with the screen vista or the closed vista. And I think this has relevance to the retail market. In the initial plan, there was an intention to have this ceremonial way, and I guess this grand vista, which later got changed, this much more complex, sort of almost chaotic relationship between this new building and this old environment. Now, of course, that was to change with the ring road being built, but I think there's something about this change to another kind of way of the building sitting within space that's quite significant. Internally and externally, that is also commented on by Chapman, A.G.E. Chapman, by the time the market was being built, had taken over as a borough architect. And he discusses the fact that they did not want blank vistas in the building. He actually uses the term vistas. He also says an interesting thing, that they didn't want just one large hall. They wanted to make the market an interesting series of spaces. And that really echoes the description of the festival in A Brief City, where they talk about intimate rooms. And so each space has a different atmosphere. It has a series of smaller, intimate spaces that you move through rather than this one big sort of huge hall. And you can see that in lots of different ways. This is a sketch of the restaurant in a different setting. And on the right is a really appalling scan of a photograph of a copy of the coffee lounge, but that coffee lounge was where that balcony is and overlooked the restaurant and through to the Sunken Garden. So there was a sense of creating both internal and external vistas. This is how the Sunken Garden looked. This is an article about rain and the Sunken Garden. We know a lot about that today. But the plan was that the Sunken Garden should look like this. This is another image from eating out in Wolverhampton, actually from an earlier period in 1956, when this is the plan for the Sunken Garden. So it was intended that this would be an outdoor room with this curtain wall of glass with an indoor space and an outdoor space related, but being able to see between these spaces and create these really interesting vistas. I thought it was also worth bringing in this functional tradition again. You can see the flowing lines of this canal with also the flowing lines of these steps going down into the Sunken Garden. While we're on gardens, planting in odd corners, not only was there a Sunken Garden envisaged, but also if you have a look at this plan, there were plans to plant at various points all around the building. This is actually the entrance. I know I've got the plan upside down, but I'm sort of heading into the entrance there. And you can see the idea of planting around it. So that was very much an inspiration from the festival as well, and other ideas. And I think ultimately what we're dealing with here is the sense that the festival encouraged people to think about the internal and the external spaces as a landscape holistically, and that there would be relationships between inside and outside. And in this section of the architectural review, it talks about the picturesque landscape as being a crucial part. And by that it means that instead of imposing order, that there is an embrace to a certain extent of what already exists and can be enhanced. And change of level is one of those things. And that's certainly apparent within the market structure, where you have these basements, you have sunken gardens, and you have different levels and balconies. Another aspect is intricacy in modern architecture, and that really is very apparent in the building. Not only have you got these obvious sort of changes of level, different shapes, different surfaces, which I'll go on to talk about in a minute, but you have literally, as you move around the building, entirely different forms. So you have these amazing wave-like structures on the meat and fish hall, and you've got this wonderful sort of much more flowing wave line on the rest of the retail market. So there is a real intricacy to the forms themselves. They're really diverse. But when you bring in wallscape, which is another aspect from the Festival of Britain, but also from previous interest from Gordon Cullen again, you can see a connection really with the festival. Terrazzo and marble surfaces were all across the lower part of these block buildings. You may remember them. They were done by the Saccaroli brothers. I can find nothing out about them. If you've got information, that would be great. But you also had these aggregate concrete panels on the other part of the building. This is a photograph which I'm really thankful to Tegan Kimbley for sending, Tom, who sent them to me with her permission. And this is when it was the antiques market, but this was the Woolpack restaurant, as it was called originally. It has these, so you've got aggregate, you've got stone-faced concrete panels, you have tiling. This is the tiling that was on the side there. So you can just see as you go into the entrance, there's tiling on that right side, and this is what it looked like. And you also have this sort of perforated brickwork, which was very connected, I think, to the festival hall, which you can see on the right. And you've got it in the Sunken Garden on the side there. So there's a real range of texture and pattern, which really gives the intricacy that was required for a festival style. That's not only on the outside, but it's also on the inside. And if you just take the restaurant again, you've got maple tiles and the acoustic panels. You had the floor, which had this got this wonderful rich colour. On the other side of it, you had a sort of wallpaper pattern, and you can see this is I managed to find this in the Wolverhampton magazine. It's Charles Clark and Sons Annual Dinner. Wasn't looking at them. Behind them is the wallpaper from the Woolpack restaurant. And you've also got patterned curtains as well. I'm afraid I don't know what they look like. So you have this amazing set of textures, which again, we're so familiar with today, but this is quite different and new. This is, Claire and I were talking about these toilets. Thanks again to Tegan for this photograph. An amazing set of these rather glamorous surfaces. So you've got these marble surfaces and these amazing sort of fixed, rather sci-fi looking stools. So all this texture, material is a really rich language in the building. And finally, lettering. Lettering was so important for a festival site, as you can imagine, for wayfinding, and so also for something like the Market Hall. And Egyptian was a really popular font, which is not quite the font, as far as I can tell. There are little flecks of difference here, which a graphic designer would be able to tell you in no time at all. But it's got the look of a festival style of font. This is again down to Tegan. I'll talk about photographs in a minute, but this is the way that the lettering sits on that wonderful canopy. It's not fixed to a wall. It's got this amazing sort of three-dimensional quality and just the way it allows you, as you walk past that lettering, to be set against all the different textures you can see there. So you can see the infill paneling, you've got the stone-faced concrete, you've got this amazing green marble which carried on through into the building, the snack bar, and you've got the aggregate concrete panels as well. And each time that the letters make a sort of different splash against those backgrounds. So there's a wonderful three-dimensionality which comes through the letters, and that was very much a principle really of the festival as well. The other thing that isn't overtly mentioned in the article, which provides these principles, is the idea of colour. And of course, that was so important to the festival. Primary colours were key. This is a wonderful photograph of either the festival being put up or taken down, I'm not sure which, but it just gives a sense of how that colour provided accents in the landscape. This is an earlier article that was in Architectural Review, and it's a drawing by John Piper of a market square with these accents of colour. And I feel that if you think about the way that the colour was provided by all these different surfaces, you get a sense of how this building had these accents of colour that were really quite important to it. Okay, I'm going to talk about implicit ideas, and those are ideas that haven't really come through overtly from the festival, but I wanted to talk about them in terms of how I think they influenced places since. And the first one is really around eating. I've got a slightly odd combination of things there, eating and history. Eating, sorry, that's my Architectural Review falling on the floor. Eating is a crucial part of the festival experience, I suppose, for obvious reasons. But there are, in a brief city, there's a sort of discussion about how the festival provided lots of different eating opportunities, from a snack to a three-course meal with a different wine for each course. And in some ways, there is this connection to the retail market environment. It becomes a shopping environment as we might understand it today, with these different opportunities to eat in different ways. So you have the restaurant, which doubled as a canteen, but could accept either 200 or 400, depending on which sources you read. And you had a snack bar, and you also had a coffee lounge. So there were lots of different senses of different ways of consuming and different ways of dwelling in the environment that is very similar to the Festival of Britain. I think also what's similar is the idea of continental sort of activity, eating outside, al fresco, drinking coffee. There's something that is really embracing the latest trends for eating and drinking. And also, I think that opens up the door for really thinking about the market as a site of change that might have opportunities for new populations that are coming into Wolverhampton at the time. And remember, this is in the 50s and 60s, at a time when you have people coming from all over the world, basically, into Wolverhampton. So there are opportunities for the market to really embrace a much more continental, international set of food, drink, eating opportunities, if you like. So I think that is changes that really came not just through the festival, but were coming into society, the idea of this more continental approach to food, much more international approach to food. And I wanted to finish by thinking about the relationship of the festival to history. All the way through the narrative about the festival is a reference to history, not history as in a style, but history as in a notion of tradition or a sense of legacy. And I think that's really an interesting idea. And it references how I began this talk, which is this notion of value and worth. And I've summarized it visually by showing you this, which is a chance glass, an advert for chance glass, which is obviously related to our Midland connections. And I love the fact that it's got this amazing flag, pennant, saying new fashioned, yet as old as time. And I think that is the principle that was trying to be found with the festival style, that though it was based on these fundamental principles that had grown up over time and that could be both but could be new, if you see what I mean, that are contemporary ideas that develop as an evolution from those principles. And Wolverhampton Market was just the same. This was a brochure that was printed to celebrate the opening and the official opening with Herbert Morrison. And it describes Wolverhampton as a market town, 1204, and sees this moment, the building of the new retail market, as this continued tradition coming through the structure of the town, really, and the way the town is thought of. And I was sort of thinking about this and thinking about how in A Brief City, it talks with rather dramatic music about a well-designed town being part of a citizen's wealth. And again, this idea of design producing wealth or value is quite interesting. And, you know, as I've been wandering through the various sources of information from 1951, I came across an article called The Anatomy of Change, which was in the Royal College of Art magazine, Arc. And there's an article, this article is by a textile designer who's also design director, as you can see. And it says that as style succeeds style, each descends from the awesome to the ridiculous through a cycle of varying appreciation. And it seemed to me that that is essentially what has happened to the retail market, that despite the demands, that despite the real attention to trying to find these fundamental principles and understand the fundamental principles of looking at a town and thinking about planning beyond style, that hasn't really worked, that the desires of the architects and designers have sort of failed in some ways, perhaps. I was reminded of that very moving and very kind of optimistic speech that I began with by W. Mervyn Law. Better environment will help to create better men and women. Better men and women will see to it that there is no turning back. And I guess there is no turning back, but I suppose I wanted to end by thinking about how one does design for the future with any longevity, if that's possible at all. And I think the retail market is somehow a statement of getting us to think about that process. And that's it.
Thanks, Jane. That was fantastic. That went so quickly. Why does that always happen?
I don't know what the time I watched stopped. So
I just wanted you to carry on. I've got a few comments from James. He says, growing up as a child in the 70s and early 80s, you know, obviously he identified with the value of Wolverhampton's built environment. It was innovative and attractive, but also efficient and effective. And we should reflect on this in terms of planning Civic Center orientated programs, which is really, you know, kind of what you were just asking. I mean, you know, how the kind of buildings that go up today, what is your opinion of those personally, you know, in comparatively to these amazing sort of examples?
I think what I'm struck by, and I don't know, I mean, you know, how people feel about this. And again, I don't want you to think I'm sort of despondency. You know, it's not like culture doesn't stop if you change from tradition. What I notice is that materials are much more temporary in the building. So you have sort of paneling, you know, things that are very temporary. And I think that says something about what we expect to last and exist. And, you know, I'm struck by things like the new station and things like that I wonder how long they will last, you know. But I think what I think is the issue is not about the buildings, but about, for Wolverhampton, I'm going to get really kind of, as a resident of Wolverhampton, this is my taxpayers' money sort of thing. It is about care. If that building had been looked after and cared for and retained, it was made of great materials. It had some, I think, probably, I mean, I'm sure there'd have been structural issues, but, you know, if things are maintained, if things are looked after, then there is a different relationship with them. I think the problem is not about the style of the buildings. I think it's about the fact that things are let to run down, then they're demolished, then something new, and then it's let to run down again. So there is this cycle. Sorry, I'm ranting now.
But do you think that they're let to run down because there's always this element of wanting to move on from something that looks kind of, that people think, oh, you know, it was made so long ago, it's dated now, we don't want to deal with that.
I think that is a Wolverhampton trait. I mean, my family have that trait, you know. They've been in Wolverhampton for probably centuries, and, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that what I'm intrigued by is the difference between a style and a kind of, and something else, I suppose. And I don't know, I just think it's so interesting. Wolverhampton is a medieval town, it's a market town, but it's always wanted to be innovative and something forward looking. But sometimes I think that's made it lose a bit of its value and respect by, you know, other cities, really, perhaps. I don't know.
James did ask if anybody remembers the Tromolator. Do you remember that, Jane?
I don't.
I'm not really sure.
Whereabouts was that?
In the Wolverhampton Centre, and it's yeah. I don't know that. Do you? I've not heard of that. If anybody knows, do let us know. Yeah. James goes on to say, you know, the kind of, he was amazed at the structural forms and the use of space, particularly when you entered through the entry of the market hall, and there was the naturally lit spaces. I mean, all that attention to detail is just, if only that was replicated now, you know, that.
I mean, there is an
amazing, you know.
There is an amazing plan which is in the archives. It's vast, and it literally is the plan to be used for door and window lintels only. I mean, it's just like mind-blowing, this amazing plan, you know, but that's just for one section of the building. So, but that's a building that we see, perhaps, or the people that were in the original market saw as maybe a real cheap version, you know, compared to their Victorian market. I mean, I suppose that's why I wanted to situate it within that sort of evolution, really.
Yeah. Jim says, over recent decades, civic leaders have talked of the need to create a continental cafe culture with partial success, but the pestilence and outside drinking and eating being seen as safer has given it a false lift off. Can this be continued, especially as the new market space has little in the way of eating and drinking spaces?
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to know how you create a culture, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think, you know, coming from the art school, we've always thought, how do you create this culture, you know? And I just don't know how it happens. I think there's got to be something organic that emerges. It's so difficult to, but having these vast spaces, which are, I don't know, I took this photograph the other day and it's just an empty space. I mean, it was before, but it had buildings all around it. And somehow there are these vast swathes of spaces that feel, I don't know, how would you even begin to start inhabiting them? And I suppose it's something about this skeleton of the ring road, which was at the basis of that plan, that sort of cast a certain way of the feel of the town. I don't know.
Yeah, it's almost, it's just starting again, isn't it? And yeah, it's quite depressing, really. I mean, I know we were chatting earlier on about the ladies' toilets that you showed with the old mirrors and I just remember when it was the vintage antiques place where the restaurant was, and it was just incredible, and you really did feel like you've gone back in time, and it just hadn't been touched. Those toilets, those mirrors, they just hadn't been touched for all that time, and it was just incredible. And now it's not there. And
I mean, but again, if it had been, I mean, but you know, the argument is about relevance, isn't it? If it becomes relevant, but I think there is something about care, isn't there? And I think that, you know, as buildings start failing, and it was the same for the first retail, well, it wasn't the first, actually, that was a market after the demolition of the previous one. You know, each generation wants something new, don't they?
Yeah. Oh yes. Okay. One from Tom. Hi, Tom. The Black Country Living Museum has now turned its focus to the latter part of the 20th century. Do you think that there could be a way to bring together like-minded organisations with a view to document and protect buildings of note in the region?
I mean, that sounds a great idea, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's what struck me about the retail market, which probably most of us remember, is how little there is documenting it, really. I mean, Tony and I can't remember if Ben was with us, but Tony and I took photographs all around that building before it was renovated in the 90s, late 90s. And I mean, I cannot find them. I've been through every part of my attic, and I went through Tony's stuff as well. Thanks to Kathy's widow. And it just shows how little fairly recent history is recorded, to be honest. I couldn't find anything hardly in the archives. I mean, thanks to Tegan for her images. But it's so frustrating. I could have taken so many more images, you know, but I think that's the thing is it's the recording of it, isn't it? It's the memory of these buildings. And then, I mean, there are so many, I don't know if this is Tom Hicks talking or it's another Tom, but
It is Tom, yeah, Tom.
Right. I mean, when, you know, I walked around with Tom to look at some of the buildings, and they're so decayed, and you can see why people want to get rid of them. It's about this care issue again, and their relevance, I think. But I mean, I think it's a great idea. I mean, you know, again, it's about genuinely having them as part of the fabric of the city, and that's the thing that seems to get, you know, I mean, when it's heartbreaking looking at the market, the retail market before this one was what we would now think of as a wonderful building, you know, and that was just demolished and sort of, so it is about relevance and I suppose value and care and how these are all integrated as part of a bigger structure, really.
Yeah. So a couple of questions from Charlotte Webb. Fabulous talk as always, Jane. Do you think that the design of our new market has taken away some of the fabulous things you've just talked about? I remember going to the market for a day trip with my mum in the 80s, and I just don't feel today's generation will get that same sense of nostalgia.
Well, do we want nostalgia? I don't know, you see, it's I mean, it was a wonderful market. It was a lovely, you know, I remember sort of going and shopping there a lot myself. But it shouldn't, I don't know, it shouldn't be about nostalgia, perhaps. I mean, the new market is a vibrant space. It's potentially, but it's not a building, is it? It's just a space, really. And maybe even the issue of markets is something, again, that needs to be reinvented. I mean, places like Shrewsbury are trying to reinvent, aren't they? And that's a kind of market from this period. Coventry still exists as a market. So again, there seems to be, maybe I'm referring to what Mervyn said, that Mervyn Law, W. Mervyn Law, the mysterious W, about it needs to be all of us sort of inhabiting these spaces. But they, you know, this space was always at a slight distance to the centre somehow, even though it's not really, but somehow it had that island life to it, which I think possibly, especially being on the side of the ring road as it became, which perhaps made it less successful. I don't really know the answer, Charlotte, but I think things have to be relevant and they have to be part of a bigger thing. So planning is really important, but can you do that on a big scale? I don't know.
And Charlotte's second question is, do you think that there is a slight echo of the typography used at the market in the building of the new bus station and railway station?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, with the use of the, yeah, I guess so. I mean, it comes across as an entirely different thing, but certainly certainly perhaps the freedom of topography, the freedom of the lettering is certainly from that, a spirit of that, definitely.
And Charlotte also says, I guess the early invention of the camera was a novelty, and then today everyone has a camera readily available.
Yeah,
so that's a good point.
yeah,
The time in between, it probably didn't seem so important to capture these things, and that's the problem, isn't it, I guess. And like you say, thanks to Tegan that she did take those pictures. But that certainly took me back, seeing those mirrors, and yeah, that's incredible. And Tom's work as well. I mean, if a lot of Tom's work, Tom's photographs, you know, lots of those buildings are just not there anymore. It's a pure documentation, isn't it, his work? Yeah, it's interesting. So, any more questions for Jane before we go? Do you want to add anything else, Jane? And I'll get all this chat sent to you so you can have a read through it.
No, not really. It was great to talk about it. There's so much more I could have said about saying about food and all sorts of things. I had loads of things about food, but I suppose it's about value, and really this was a valued building at one point. And how did it stop being valued, and how do things like that happen? And yeah, I think to answer Tom's question, these buildings are so important. They have been a really crucial moment. You can see from the architectural review sort of things that I drew out how thought through so much of this building was, and how nice it was to experience, even if you didn't kind of get all those connections. And I suppose it's the thoughtfulness of architecture from this period that, because they've been neglected, sort of gets forgotten, really. And yeah, I think they should be recorded in some way, you know, but whether Wolverhampton is the place to do that, sure.
Jim Barrow made a suggestion. He says some of the old street patterns still exist in the Manor and Wolverhampton centres. How about going back to the future, as they are cold, dead areas at night, open them up again and start to develop the empty spaces? Yeah, I mean, it's those empty spaces, isn't it? They're just not doing anything.
Yeah, it's about us, isn't it? Doing it though, as a you know, I think what was interesting when I was reading about from Peter Larkham's article, he said that not many people were really that involved with the notion of the reconstruction, and I suppose it's maybe the disconnect between the Wolverhampton population and perhaps the people doing the planning. Maybe that's the problem, really.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for your questions. I will get all the chat over to Jane so she can read through it. There's some interesting little points in there. Jane, as always, thank you so much. We love your talks.
Very kind.
Then, you know, there's just stuff in there about the history of the market that perhaps not many people are aware of. Certainly I wasn't. It's always a pleasure. So our next Festival of Britain talk is Tuesday the 17th of August at 7 p.m, and it's with artist Sean McFarlane about the festival and Warsaw. So that proves to be very interesting. Please do make it if you can. You can book for free through Eventbrite. So thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.